The fluorescent lights hummed above Sacred Heart Hospital's emergency department like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. Ashley Cooper pushed through the ER entrance at 05 for 5, carrying a paper bag with a cracked coffee mug and a dying succulent, her badge clipped to scrubs that hung loose on a frame built for speed, not comfort. 6 years since Helmand Province. 6 years since she'd been anyone but a quiet nurse who kept her head down. The smell hit her first, antiseptic layered over stale coffee and something metallic underneath, the way hospitals always smelled like they were trying to cover up what they actually were. Morgues pretending to be sanctuaries. She'd cleaned trauma bays under mortar fire that felt more honest than this. She moved through the corridors like she was reading a room she'd never seen before, though she'd walked these halls for exactly 4 days. Her eyes tracked exits without her permission. Blind spots materialized in her mind. The mental map built itself: second exit on the left, supply closet with 2 doors, emergency shower station 16 feet from the trauma bays. Her hands knew things her conscious mind wasn't supposed to know anymore: how to move through chaos, how to find the path when everything was burning. Her locker was in the back corner, third from the end. She hung her jacket carefully, smoothing the fabric, her fingers finding the worn patch sewn inside the lining before she could stop them. Navy SEAL warfare insignia, faded to almost nothing. The trident was barely visible, stitched in by hands that had performed surgery in sandstorms. She pulled her hand away quickly and closed the locker door. The morning shift started with rounds. Dr. Sterling was already in motion when she arrived at the nursing station, moving through the department with the kind of casual ownership that came from old money and older connections. His watch cost more than her monthly rent, a Rolex Submariner, steel and gold, the kind that commanded attention just by existing on his wrist. He wore Italian leather shoes on hospital tile, dress pants that probably had a tailor on speed dial, and an expression that suggested he was constantly disappointed by everyone in the vicinity. Ashley positioned herself at the far edge of the group, holding the patient charts, speaking only when spoken to. "Yes, doctor." "No, doctor." "Of course, doctor." The words tasted like swallowing rust, but they were necessary. Invisibility was a survival skill. She'd learned it in Helmand. She was relearning it here. Dr. Sterling barely glanced at her. He saw what he wanted to see: a quiet woman, mid-40s, competent enough but unremarkable, the kind of nurse who didn't ask questions and didn't draw attention. What he didn't see was the 3-second tactical scan she performed entering each room, the way her eyes catalogued equipment positions and personnel locations before her body had fully crossed the threshold. He didn't see how she positioned herself at 45-degree angles, never with her back fully to a door. He didn't see the scar tissue mapping her forearms, the calluses on her hands that no regular hospital nurse would develop. When a trauma alert came through at 0630, motorcycle versus semi-truck, ETA 5 minutes, her fingers moved before her mind caught up. She was prepping a 14-gauge angiocath needle set, running through the mental inventory of supplies they'd need. Chest tube tray. Level 1 rapid infuser. 2 units of packed red cells already thawed. She didn't remember deciding to do this. Her body knew. Her body had done it before, in places where the electricity came from generators and the surgical lights never stayed bright enough. Dr. Sterling watched from across the unit. His eyes narrowed slightly. She felt the weight of his attention like a scope settling on her, and she forced her hands to slow down, to look less practiced. But it was already too late. He'd seen something. She could read it in the small tightening at the corner of his mouth. The patient arrived, a 17-year-old boy with a fractured femur and a chest injury that was bleeding somewhere they couldn't see yet. 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist jumped in. Ashley maintained position, charting the incoming vitals, documenting which fluids were running, monitoring the monitor screen where numbers climbed and fell like a heartbeat translated into data. O2 sat climbing, 88, 89, 91. Good. The boy was stabilizing. For now. Dr. Sterling ordered a CT scan. Ashley noted it down in the system, and that's when she saw it. The billing code he'd used for the CT didn't match the procedure. The documentation in his orders referenced a surgical consultation that had happened 2 days ago, but the chart showed no patient in bed for on that date. She noticed because she'd been trained to notice. Because in Helmand Province, missing details got people killed. Because 23 years of military service had wired her brain to see inconsistencies the way other people saw color. She didn't write it down. She didn't mention it. She simply logged it in the part of her mind that was still a senior chief petty officer, filing it away with the other things that didn't add up. The billing code was wrong. The dates didn't match. There was a phantom surgical consult floating in Sacred Heart system, generating charges for services that had never happened. She'd deal with it later. If she dealt with it at all. The morning shift moved into its rhythm. Patient cycled through. Vitals stabilized or deteriorated. The heart monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm, and she moved through the ER with a kind of invisible efficiency that made her background fade into the walls. Deferential. Quiet. A nurse who nodded and followed orders. At 0600 the morning briefing happened in the staff lounge. 12 people gathered around the coffee station, 3 other nurses, 2 residents, a respiratory therapist, 2 paramedics passing through, and Dr. Sterling, who leaned against the doorframe with his coffee in a ceramic mug that someone had probably washed for him. Ashley stood at the back near the supply cabinet. She was refilling a crash cart, moving quietly, not drawing attention. She'd learned how to be a person in a room without being a person in a room. It was a useful skill. No one was supposed to notice her here. "So I'm making a formal wager," Dr. Sterling said. His voice had that particular quality of arrogance that belonged to people who'd never experienced consequences. "Our little Navy nurse here won't last the week. Any takers?" The room went quiet. Ashley's hands continued moving, organizing supplies with methodical precision. She didn't look up. She didn't change her breathing. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the specific kind of restraint that had kept her alive in places where showing emotion meant showing weakness. She touched the inside of her jacket unconsciously, fingers finding the worn unit patch for just a second before she pulled her hand away. Someone laughed. It was nervous laughter, the kind people made when they sensed they were watching something that might turn into a problem. Dr. Sterling smiled, the kind of smile that came from absolute certainty that he was the most important person in any given space. He didn't know she was standing behind him. Or he knew and didn't care. Either way, the words hung in the air like humidity before a storm. "Any takers?" he repeated. No one spoke. The coffee maker gurgled. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. And Ashley Cooper finished refilling the crash cart, closed the cabinet door with a soft click, and walked past Dr. Sterling on her way back to the ER. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't acknowledge that she'd heard him. She simply moved past him the way water moves past a rock, present, aware, and utterly unchanged. But he'd made a mistake. He'd announced the wager, made it official, put it in front of witnesses. And she was already noticing the billing discrepancies. She was already a problem he didn't know he had yet. The morning shift continued. The boy from the motorcycle accident was stable, scheduled for surgery, going to live because the team had done their jobs. Ashley documented every intervention, every fluid, every medication pushed into his full line. Her charting was meticulous, the kind of obsessive attention to detail that came from knowing that missing information could cost lives. By 0730, she documented 3 separate phantom consultations. All under Dr. Sterling's signature. All generating revenue for procedures that existed nowhere in the actual patient record. She closed out her shift notes and clocked out at 1500, moving through the Houston heat to the bus stop where rain hadn't fallen in 8 days and the sky pressed down like a judgment. She didn't know yet that Dr. Sterling had made calls to 3 board members that morning. She didn't know that her meticulous charting had already begun unraveling something far larger than a single corrupt physician. She didn't know that a SEAL commander was going to arrive in 72 hours in catastrophic condition, needing someone with her exact skill set to keep him breathing. She only knew that she'd made it through day 4, and she'd kept her invisible cloak intact. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sterling was a competent administrator who wielded institutional power like a weapon, and he was about to discover that one quiet nurse was a threat to everything he'd built. The staff lounge at Sacred Heart Hospital smelled like burnt coffee and exhaustion at 0600. 12 people occupied the space, residents slouched against vending machines, nurses reviewing charts in corners, the fluorescent overhead lights casting everything in a sickly white. Dr. Sterling stood near the coffee maker, his tailored suit somehow pristine despite the 16-hour shift he'd just completed. He didn't just look expensive. He looked like money that had never been told no. "I'm making a formal wager," Sterling announced, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Our little Navy nurse here won't last the week." He'd said it casually, gesturing toward Ashley with his coffee cup. She sat 3 feet away, staring into her own mug. She didn't look up. "Any takers?" Sterling continued. Laughter rippled through the room, the kind of tired laughter that comes from broken sleep and 18-hour shifts. A resident grinned. An attending nurse rolled her eyes and turned back to her charts. The message was delivered. The message was received. Ashley was the outsider. And outsiders don't last. She took one measured breath and kept her eyes on the black surface of her coffee. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. But something inside her, something that had been trained in the mountains of Helmand Province to absorb punishment without breaking, made note of the wager, the laughter, the precise angle of Sterling's smile. Pain is information, they taught her. This was information. 2 hours later, during afternoon rounds on the cardiac unit, Sterling found her checking a patient's full line. "Sweetheart," he called out, using the word like a knife wrapped in honey. The patient's daughter looked up from her bedside chair. "My reading glasses. They're in my office. Would you fetch them?" Like a deer. "Fetch." The word hung in the air like a physical object. Ashley finished securing the foresight and straightened her posture with the slow deliberation of someone who had learned long ago that visible anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I can request someone from the desk to assist you, doctor." "No need." Sterling smiled at the patient's daughter. "She doesn't mind." "Do you, sweetheart?" The daughter shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The moment had texture now, awkward and sharp. Ashley met his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When she spoke, her voice came out steady and quiet, like still water. "I've cleaned up worse messes from better men." The room went absolutely silent. Sterling's jaw tightened. A muscle worked in his cheek. He turned and walked away without responding, which somehow hurt him more than any comeback could have. His power had always been in the ability to make others small. When someone didn't get small, when they just stood there looking at you with eyes that had seen things he couldn't comprehend, it was harder to maintain the fiction that he was in control. But he was still in control. The hospital was still his. The cafeteria incident happened at 12:30 during shift change, when the dining area was most crowded. Ashley stood in line with her tray, a turkey sandwich, soup, coffee, a small salad. She turned from the register and walked toward a corner table where 2 other nurses were eating. The crowd was thick. Bodies pressed close. The air smelled like industrial cleaner and reheated food. Dr. Sterling emerged from the opposite side of the crowd, moving with the ease of someone who knew everyone would move for him. He didn't slow down. He didn't adjust his trajectory. His elbow connected with her tray with what might have been an accident if you didn't look at his face. The soup went first, a splash of brown liquid that hit the floor and her scrubs. The sandwich followed, spinning once before landing face down in the spreading mess. The coffee cup shattered on impact, ceramic pieces skittering across the tile. The entire cafeteria went quiet. 23 people stopped eating mid-bite. Conversations died. Silverware went still. The only sound was the wet slop of soup spreading across the floor and the smallest fragments of ceramic still sliding across the tile. Sterling stood directly over the mess and dropped a patient chart at her feet, pages exploding across the spilled food like birds taking flight. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying across the dead silence. And try to get the charting right this time. I've noticed some discrepancies. The implication was layered. Some discrepancies. Charting errors were reportable. Charting errors could cost a license. Charting errors could mean the difference between a nurse remaining employed and that nurse being investigated by hospital administration. One tear escaped from Ashley's left eye, not from sadness, but from the sheer pressure of restraint, the physical cost of standing in front of 23 people and accepting humiliation without visible response. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, and something in that gesture made a younger nurse named Jennifer 2 tables over stand up to help. Sterling raised his hand. Let her handle it. She wanted a job here. Ashley knelt in the spilled food. Her knees pressed against wet tile. She collected the chart pages first, her hands moving with mechanical precision. The papers were soggy but legible. As she stacked them, her eyes fell on a billing code that didn't match the handwriting above it. The entry showed a surgical consultation for a patient named Morrison, a SEAL training accident case, and the code indicated $1,500 in specialist fees. She'd charted that patient the night before. Morrison had never mentioned seeing a surgeon. She'd been there the entire shift. She was certain. She filed this away in the same part of her brain that had learned to catalogue threats and inconsistencies. Her hands didn't shake as she collected the sandwich, the cup fragments, the napkins. Her expression remained neutral as Sterling walked away without another word, but the information settled into place like another scar on a body that had learned to absorb damage without showing the impact. That night, around 2100, Sterling sat in his private office on the second floor. The hospital had gone quiet, only skeleton staff remained on night shift. He pulled up Ashley's personnel file on his computer and began making phone calls. First call, board member Patricia Hendricks. I have concerns about our recent hire. The Navy nurse. Psychological fitness issues, I think. We should probably explore those. Second call, board member David Crenshaw. Medication count irregularities. Nothing confirmed, but we should probably investigate before there's a problem. Third call, board member James Rivera. I'm just saying, we brought her in too fast. Background check was thorough, but you never know what people are hiding. The calls were planted seeds. Sterling understood institutional power the way a farmer understands soil. You didn't need to prove something was broken. You just needed enough people questioning whether it might be. By tomorrow, Ashley would be on everyone's watch list. By the end of the week, a formal investigation would begin. By the end of the month, she'd be gone. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied. The phantom surgical billing had been his secret for 18 months. The offshore account held $487,000. The Shell clinic in Pasadena was registered under his wife's maiden name. The system was perfect because no one was looking. And now, the one person whose charting habits, the kind of meticulous documentation that belonged in a field hospital where every detail meant the difference between death and survival, was flagging inconsistencies. She was gone tomorrow. The investigation would fall apart once she was fired. The system would hold. He had no idea what was about to walk through his trauma bay, or that a grizzled Master Chief was already in the building, already memorizing details, already understanding that something was wrong with the ER director's explanation of how a SEAL commander had survived a tension pneumothorax that should have killed him in 4 minutes. What happened next didn't just change the day. It cracked open everything Sterling had built. The helicopter dropped Commander Jake Morrison at Sacred Heart's emergency bay at 1847 hours, rotors still spinning as trauma attendants wheeled the stretcher through the automatic doors. 23 years old, SEAL Team 3 Charlie Platoon, training accident at Naval Station Houston, tension pneumothorax from a fast rope insertion gone wrong. His breath came in shallow gasps. Blood pressure 88/56 and falling. The trauma surgeon barked orders, nurses mobilized, and somewhere in the controlled chaos of the ER, Dr. Sterling appeared with a chart and a calculation already forming behind his eyes. Ashley was 3 rooms down, restocking a crash cart, when she heard the call. Commander Morrison. Tension pneumothorax. Immediate needle decompression required. She moved without thinking, hands already reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle, muscle memory older than her civilian life, muscle memory that belonged to a different woman in a different uniform. Sterling intercepted her at the supply room door. Morrison's case is assigned to Henderson and Caldwell, he said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. You're finishing your charting on the Rodriguez patient. Not a suggestion. Not a request. An order designed to keep her peripheral, to keep her hands off a case that might require the kind of precise documentation she was already known for. The documentation that was slowly unraveling his phantom surgical billing through shell companies. Ashley nodded. Step back. Let him pass. The first rule of staying invisible was accepting the chains they tried to bind you with. But by 1923 hours, Morrison was in Trauma Bay 2, and Ashley found a reason to restock the supplies near the doorway. She could see his chest. Could see the needle going in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Could see the hiss of air escaping, that singular sound that meant pressure was releasing, that a man was getting a second breath. O2 sat climbing. 68, 72. 79, she watched the monitor display his vital signs like a story being told in real time. The covering physician was a second-year resident named Chen, competent but young, still learning the grammar of crisis. Sterling hovered at the periphery, watching, waiting, calculating. It was Ortega who appeared beside her, the combat medic from the visiting unit, the one who'd watched her hands move 3 days ago and asked the question she couldn't answer. They're calling it clean, he said quietly, not looking at her, just staring at Morrison's monitor the way she was. Needle decompression, pneumothorax collapsed, vitals stabilizing. He's going to make it. Something in his voice told her he was testing her somehow, waiting for recognition. She kept her eyes on Morrison's chest, on the thin line of a man still fighting gravity. For now, she said. Just 2 words. But Ortega's shoulders tensed like he'd heard something larger underneath them. Morrison seemed stable through dinner shift. Oxygen saturation holding at 94%. Heart rate down to 106. Even Sterling seemed to relax, the tension in his jaw unwinding as he noted that this case would resolve without complications, without scrutiny, without the kind of detailed chart reviews that made him nervous. But at 2,200 hours, Morrison's monitor began telling a different story. His chest pain returned, not the sharp pneumothorax pain, but something deeper, something that made his whole body stiffen against the bed. His heart sounds became muffled, as if someone had turned down the volume on a radio. His pulse paradoxus appeared, that dangerous drop in blood pressure when he inhaled, a sign that pressure was building again, that something was filling spaces that needed to stay empty. Pericardial tamponade. Acute. His pericardial sac was slowly becoming a prison for his own heart. Chen called for an EKG. Called for a chest CT, started ordering the kind of tests that take time, that require transport to radiology, that delay the only intervention that actually saves a man when his heart is drowning in its own fluid, an emergency pericardiocentesis, a needle driven through the sternum into the sac itself to drain the blood before it crushes the organ completely. Ashley was in the break room, still in scrubs because she'd never actually clocked out, just stopped by to eat the cold sandwich she'd prepared 7 hours ago. The intercom crackled, code blue, Trauma Bay 2. Her sandwich fell to the tile. She was moving before the announcement finished. Sterling was already there when she rounded the corner. So were Chen and 2 other attending physicians, and the resident who'd tried to protest earlier was being quietly shepherded toward the door by a nursing supervisor. Sterling stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Morrison's grey face and the monitor showing a blood pressure of 67/41. Additional imaging, Sterling announced. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to obedience. We need confirmation before we move to invasive intervention. Get him to CT. One of the attendings nodded. The other scribbled in the chart. Ortega stood near the door, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, and when his eyes met Ashley's, she saw the moment he understood. They were watching a man die by committee. They were watching a calculation unfold in real time. If Morrison died here, it was a tragic outcome from a training accident, buried under hospital policy and insurance paperwork and the kind of institutional forgetting that protected people like Sterling. If Morrison survived surgery, the chart would be reviewed, scrutinized, dissected by every quality assurance officer and attending surgeon in the hospital, and those kinds of close examinations had a way of exposing inconsistencies like phantom billing and shell company invoicing. Sterling's voice dropped to the register reserved for absolute authority. He's too unstable for the OR. We make him comfortable and monitor his vitals. The words fell into the trauma bay like a sentence. Time of death will be 2,231 hours. Morrison's oxygen saturation was 71% now. His heart was slowing, not the good kind of slowing, not the kind that meant relaxation, but the kind that meant surrender. A monitor showed the thin line of a man running out of time. She could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat in her own chest, that ancient recognition one trauma survivor has for another. The resident opened his mouth. Sterling's eyes cut toward him like a blade. The resident closed his mouth and walked out, following the supervisor's quiet gesture. Ashley moved backward, away from the trauma bay, her scrub still carrying the smell of antiseptic and that metallic undertone that comes from old blood dried on tile. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, down to the first floor, toward the parking lot where rain had started to fall against Houston's endless summer heat. She was almost to her car when Ortega caught her in the hallway. "They're giving up on him," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact from a man who'd seen this movie before, probably in a forward operating base with different walls but the same calculation. All of them. Ashley didn't answer. She just kept moving, but something in her hip pocket felt heavier than it should, the outline of her phone, the number that was no longer valid, the chain of command that had decided her future without asking. She made it to the side entrance near the service corridor, the one that attendings used to sneak outside without being paged. Still wearing scrubs. Still bearing the weight of 3 tours and 17 operators extracted from a kill zone and 24 lives held together with her own hands and a prayer that the medevac would arrive before the clock ran out. The trauma bay window was visible from the service hallway, a clear view into the space where Commander Morrison lay with his heart slowly crushing itself under the weight of blood that had nowhere else to go. His monitor still displayed the numbers. BP 60/40. O2 sat 68. Heart rate erratic now, skipping beats like a song with the wrong tempo. Sterling was there, pen in hand, preparing to write the official time of death on a chart that would be filed and forgotten within a month. She reached down and touched the inside of her jacket lining, where the patch was sewn, the faded unit insignia from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Dark Horse, stitched there by her own hands the night before discharge, a ghost of the woman she'd been before Houston, before this hospital, before she'd learned to push a mop and answer to just a nurse. The patch felt warm against her fingers. The rain outside hammered the glass doors like applause. Sterling was saying something to the assembled team, words about comfort care and realistic expectations and the limits of medical intervention. Ashley stepped through the trauma bay doorway. Not walking around the perimeter, not asking permission, not deferring to the physicians who believed their authority was absolute. She walked directly to Morrison's bedside. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a register she hadn't used in public since the day she'd signed out of her command, steady, certain, carrying the weight of someone who'd already survived the worst. Pericardiocentesis. Now. Not a request. A command. Sterling's face registered shock for 0.3 seconds before it hardened. "You're not assigned to this case," he said, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "Leave this trauma bay or I will have security remove you and file a formal complaint for insubordination." The other physicians hesitated. Chen looked between Sterling and Ashley, caught between the official hierarchy and something he couldn't quite name. "Dr. Sterling," he started, but Ashley was already moving. She crossed to the crash cart. Her hands found the equipment with precision, the catheter, the ultrasound probe, the 18-gauge needle that would pierce through sternum and pericardium to drain the blood drowning his heart. Sterling grabbed her shoulder. "Stop." She didn't break stride. She didn't acknowledge him. She just moved like a woman who'd done this before under artillery fire in Helmand Province, with mortar rounds shaking the aid station around her and a SEAL officer whose name she couldn't remember bleeding out on a stretcher because she'd been the only one qualified to stop the hemorrhage. Morrison's eyes opened when she reached his bedside. He saw her face and something shifted, some recognition not of her personally, but of the kind of person she was. The kind of person who didn't give up when the official word was surrender. Sterling was still shouting orders, "Someone stop her, someone get security, this is a direct violation of hospital protocol," but Ashley was guiding the needle through skin and fascia, and the ultrasound image was showing her exactly what she needed to see. The pericardial sac. The blood. The margin of time before a man's heart stopped being a pump and became just a drum with no rhythm. The needle slipped in with the kind of precision that only comes from practice, from having done this exact procedure twice before in a combat surgical team with the building shaking and blood on her gloves and a hand-powered suction device that might fail at any second. The hiss of air escaped. No, the sound of blood draining. The relief valve opening. Morrison's oxygen saturation began climbing immediately. 70, 75. 82, his heart rate steadied. His blood pressure, which had been a whisper at 60/40, began climbing toward something that might sustain conscious thought. Sterling had moved to the doorway. His face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with understanding. The chart was in his hands. The detailed chart. The one that would now be scrutinized by every attending surgeon in the hospital, because this case would become a teaching moment, a case study in how to recognize what the covering physician had missed. Ashley kept working, her hands moving with the kind of steady precision that speaks of thousands of hours of training. She drained 240 milliliters of blood from the pericardial space, enough to change the pressure dynamics, enough to let Morrison's heart remember how to beat on its own. The monitor stabilized. The crisis, the acute phase, held in those 2 minutes where a man either continued living or began the process of dying. Sterling backed out of the trauma bay. One of the other attendings murmured something about calling surgery. Chen was writing in the chart with renewed focus, documenting everything now, because everyone in the room understood what had just happened. A nurse had performed an emergency procedure that Dr. Sterling had explicitly forbidden, that he'd said was contraindicated, that he'd decided wouldn't happen. Ashley stepped back from Morrison's bedside. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She looked directly at Sterling, standing in the doorway like a man who'd just watched his entire calculation collapse. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The chart would say it. The monitor would say it. Morrison's grey face returning to something closer to normal coloration would say it. She reached for the trauma room door handle, the one that locked from the inside, the one that would keep Sterling from issuing any more orders about comfort care or realistic expectations. Her fingers found the deadbolt. Turned it. The click of that lock engaging sounded like the end of something and the beginning of something else all at once. Sterling tried the door handle from outside. Pulled. Found it unyielding. "Open this door," he called out, his voice still carrying authority but now carrying desperation underneath it. "That is a direct order." Ashley didn't answer. She was already back at Morrison's bedside, checking the for access, confirming the chest tube remained in position, beginning the real work that would fill the next 90 minutes, the work of keeping a man alive when official medicine had declared him unsalvageable. Outside the locked door, she could hear Sterling calling for security. Could hear him explaining to someone on the phone what had just happened, how an insubordinate nurse had breached protocol, how he would be filing complaints. Could hear him already calculating how to protect himself from what she'd just exposed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling didn't know yet, couldn't know, not until the investigation began, that his own calculation had created the evidence of his crime. Because the kind of meticulous charting that had flagged the phantom billing? That same habit, that same obsessive documentation born from combat medicine, had captured everything. Every deviation from protocol. Every questionable order. Every moment where a physician's financial interest had trumped a patient's medical need. The room went quiet except for the sound of Morrison's ventilator breathing for him, the steady hiss and release that meant he had time now, that the urgency had shifted from saving his life in the next 2 minutes to keeping him stable through the night. The ventilator's mechanical rhythm was the only steady thing left. Morrison's chest rose and fell with the machine's commands, but his heart was betraying him. 02 for 5 hours, the numbers on the monitor scrolling downward like a countdown to nothing. Cardiac arrest. Flat line. Every available physician in Sacred Heart's ER had cycled through the trauma room, tried their protocols, consulted their guidelines, and reached the same conclusion: this man was unsalvageable. The SEAL commander had survived IEDs and ambushes and 10,000 things designed to kill him, but a training accident hemorrhage into his chest cavity was something medicine couldn't fix. Not here. Not anymore. Call it, Dr. Sterling said from the doorway, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd already written the death certificate in his mind. 90 minutes is protocol. He's gone. The resident looked at Ashley. The attending looked at Sterling. Nobody moved toward the power switch on the ventilator. That tiny hesitation was everything. Ashley didn't respond. She didn't argue. She didn't offer alternatives or plead for more time. She simply locked the trauma room door with a soft click that sounded like a bullet sliding into a chamber, and Dr. Sterling's face transformed, first confusion, then understanding, then something that looked almost like fear. He pounded on the glass. Shouted her name like it was a curse. She didn't look at him. The heart monitor was a flat line that needed to become something else. Morrison's pericardial sac was full of blood. She'd suspected it when his JVD climbed and his BP crashed despite the O2, despite the fluids, despite everything Sterling had refused to allow her to touch. Now she was out of time and out of permission, which meant she was finally free to work. Her hands moved with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this twice before in a place where the building shook from mortar fire and there was no backup and failure meant someone's wife got a folded flag. She didn't think about the door. Didn't think about Sterling screaming for security. Didn't think about the career she was about to immolate. She prepped the subxiphoid approach, that hollow beneath the sternum where a needle could slip between the ribs and find the pericardial sac if your anatomy knowledge wasn't from textbooks but from battlefield experience where you learned by doing or your patient died. 18 gauge. Cold metal. She felt for the landmarks with her fingertips, mapping the invisible geometry of a man's chest cavity. Pain was information. Every subtle resistance told her something. Skin. Fascia. The moment when resistance changed character and she was in the pericardium. The syringe filled with dark blood. 60 ccs. Morrison's oxygen saturation began climbing. 68. 72, 78. His blood pressure responded like a door opening. 70/45, then 85/50, then 100/60. The monitor shifted from flatline to a fragile rhythm that looked almost alive. Come on, she whispered, not to him but to his body, to the physiology that was trying so hard to survive if someone would just stop predicting his death and let him live. She adjusted the ventilator, higher PEEP to re-expand his lungs, better oxygen delivery. 3 pressure bags hung on the 4-pole. Epinephrine, vasopressin, dopamine running through peripheral lines that shouldn't have been enough but were, because enough and no other choice were sometimes the same thing. 90 minutes. The door rattled with every minute that passed. Sterling's voice grew hoarse from shouting. Someone tried to override the lock from outside. She heard the badge reader beeping, the code entered, the mechanical failure as she'd disabled it earlier, a small precaution that was now saving her patient's life. At some point she'd need to account for that. At some point she'd need to explain how she knew the hospital's security systems well enough to disable them. Not now. Not while Morrison's heart was trying to remember how to beat on its own. The second aspiration drew another 40 ccs of accumulated blood. The third came at the 85-minute mark, 20 ccs, less than before, which meant the bleeding was slowing, which meant his surgery could work instead of being a funeral rite performed by someone concerned about billable hours. His sinus rhythm was stable. His pupils reactive. His oxygen sat at 94%, which wasn't recovery but was the margin between alive and dead, and margins were all she'd ever been given to work with. At 0415 hours, Master Chief Ortega appeared at the window. He'd been standing there for maybe 40 minutes. She'd seen him peripherally, watching the procedure with the complete absence of expression that meant he understood exactly what was happening. He was recording on his phone. Good. He knew why. Ashley unlocked the door. Dr. Sterling stood waiting with two security guards wearing the confused posture of men who's been ordered to remove a nurse but weren't entirely sure that removing this one was a good idea. Behind Sterling, a hospital administrator whose name was printed on a placard she'd never bothered to read. 3 board members she recognized from the cafeteria. They'd already made their decision before she'd opened the door. "You're fired." Sterling's voice was a knife trying to cut through her composure and finding nothing to stick to. "Effective immediately. Insubordination. Unauthorized procedures. Psychological unfitness for duty. Security will escort you out." The administrator handed her termination papers that were already signed, backdated to this morning. She'd been fired before she'd locked the door. Before she'd saved Morrison's life. Before anything except the moment Sterling decided her presence threatened him. Ashley removed her badge without comment. The plastic rectangle with her photo, taken 4 days ago, back when she still thought anonymity was possible, landed in Sterling's palm with a soft click. She was no longer part of this place. The cardboard box sat in her locker like a prophecy. She packed it with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned to own nothing that mattered. A cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in chipped letters. A dying succulent that had survived 3 deployments and a medical discharge but was finally giving up on Houston's heat. A photograph from San Juan Valley, 2011, her squad leader Rodriguez in front of their aid station, hands on hips, grinning like he believed he'd see his daughter's high school graduation. He hadn't. 37 days after this photo, his convoy hit an IED and Rodriguez went home in a flag-draped box, and Ashley had spent the next 6 years learning how to function with that kind of weight living inside her chest. Rain started at 0530 as she walked out through the main entrance. Not gentle rain. The kind that hammered the pavement like applause, like judgment, like the universe confirming something she'd always suspected about mercy in places that called themselves hospitals. She didn't cry. The rain made it unnecessary. Her breath fogged in the Houston cold, early morning, the city still mostly dark, the bus stop 3 blocks away where she'd have to stand and wait for a vehicle that might not come, carrying a box containing the sum of her life, which apparently fit in a space the size of a cereal carton. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that changed everything. At 0700 hours, in an apartment 23 minutes from Sacred Heart, her 17-year-old son Marcus found the termination letter on the kitchen table. Not the copy she'd meant to hide. The official one. Hospital letterhead. Her name in bold. The phrase, "unfit for duty," circled in Sterling's handwriting, which was the kind of cruelty that required extra effort. He could have just left it, but he'd needed to mark it, brand it, make sure she understood that he was the one who'd decided her value. Marcus had been told never to open the storage unit in the back of the apartment's closet. He was a good kid, respectful, quiet, the kind of 17-year-old who didn't ask his mother where she went when she left the Navy, didn't ask why she woke up screaming sometimes, didn't ask why there were photographs of people in military uniforms hidden in the back of her bedroom closet like evidence of a previous life. He'd respected those boundaries. Until he read the termination letter. Then he opened the storage unit, and everything she'd tried to bury, for years of trying to bury it, was suddenly exposed in the morning light. The medals were in a shadow box. Bronze stars with the Vela device. A silver star. 2 purple hearts. And underneath them, the Navy Cross, the one that came with a citation that read like a documentary of the worst day of her life. San Juan Valley, October 2011. Operator down in a kill zone. She'd run into fire that was active and continuous and designed to keep people in the dirt, and she dragged a 200-pound SEAL operator back across 200 meters of open ground while rounds snapped past her head and her own blood was mixing with his, and she'd done it because the alternative was leaving him there, which wasn't an option that existed in her decision tree. The Navy Cross was for that. Marcus didn't understand what it meant yet. He only knew it was there, and his mother's termination letter was also there, and the equation didn't balance. So at 1,200 hours, while Ashley was standing in a rain-soaked bus shelter with wet cardboard and a dying plant, Marcus Cooper walked through Sacred Heart Hospital's main entrance carrying a shadow box like it was evidence of a crime. He was still wearing his school uniform. The lobby held maybe 40 people, staff between shifts, visitors waiting for information, a patient in a wheelchair getting discharged. Marcus didn't hesitate. He moved toward the center of the space with the purpose of someone who'd spent his entire life watching his mother move, and he'd learned something about authority from watching her stand still. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper," he said. The room's noise level dropped like someone had muted a speaker. "She saved a man's life last night. And your hospital fired her for it." His voice cracked on the second sentence, but he didn't stop. He opened the shadow box. A trembling nurse named Patterson, the same nurse Ashley had trained on for placement 2 days ago, took the file Marcus offered. Her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. "Bronze Star with Valor," Patterson read aloud, her voice climbing an octave. "Bronze Star with Valor. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped. A resident dropped her coffee cup and it shattered on the tile floor with a sound like confirmation. The elevator doors opened, and Master Chief Ortega wheeled Commander Jake Morrison through them. Morrison was pale, post-operative, barely conscious, but he was alive. He was there. The four-pole swayed with the movement of the wheelchair, and Ortega's voice carried across the lobby with the volume of someone who'd spent 2 decades giving orders in places where being quiet meant dying. "Senior Chief Cooper is a combat medical specialist, Special Warfare Command. SEAL Team 3. SEAL Team 7. Attached to MARSOC elements. That's Marine Corps Special Operations." She conducted a field expedient pericardiocentesis at 02:45 this morning while this hospital's senior physician was ordering her to let this man die. Ortega pointed to each medal in the box. Sanjin Valley, October 2011. Marja Hospital Defense, February 2012. Op Grizzly, June 2013. She held a femoral artery for 40 minutes with her bare hands in a shot-down helicopter while the pilot burned. He paused. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. "That's who saved your commander's life when your doctors quit." Morrison's voice was weak from anesthesia and trauma, but it carried, "That's her. That's the nurse." A man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. Navy investigator. He'd been quietly auditing Dr. Sterling's billing records for 6 weeks. Master Chief had made a call while Ashley was locked in that trauma room, had explained the situation to someone with authority and access, and that someone had been building a case ever since. The investigator held a tablet showing $1.3 million in fraudulent surgical consult charges. Shell companies. Phantom procedures. Every detail that Ashley's meticulous charting, the kind drilled into combat medics where one mistake meant death, had exposed without her even realizing she was documenting evidence. Local news cameras appeared. Ortega had called them an hour ago. They were filming everything. Dr. Sterling went white. He tried to back toward the administrator's office. The investigator's voice continued. Senior Chief Cooper walked away from active duty in 2018 when PTSD became untenable after losing half her unit in an ambush she survived. She chose civilian work. Chose anonymity. Chose to keep saving lives where her name would mean nothing to anyone. He looked at Sterling. "You tried to destroy her because she threatened to expose your fraud." The front doors opened again. A 2-star admiral in dress whites entered, flanked by 2 military police. The lobby froze. "Dr. Sterling, You are hereby terminated and escorted from this facility pending federal fraud charges related to billing violations, conspiracy, and destruction of evidence." The Admiral nodded to the MPs. "Take him." Sterling tried to speak. The Admiral cut him off with a look that made grown men flinch. "You wagered that a decorated officer would quit after a week. You're done." They walked Sterling out in front of the cameras, past 40 staff members standing in complete silence. Past the eye contact of people he'd humiliated. Past the machinery of his own institutional power, now repurposed and pointed at his throat. Marcus handed his mother's medals to the closest person, a resident named Chen who'd been too junior to stand up to Sterling but was standing very still now, holding the Navy Cross like it might explain everything that had just happened. By dawn, the rain had turned everything in Houston to slick gray concrete and reflected neon. Ashley stood at a bus stop on Richmond Avenue with a cardboard box containing 3 things: a cracked coffee mug from a 2009 deployment, a dying succulent she'd kept alive through sheer stubbornness, and a photograph of Senior Chief Rodriguez pressed between sheets of tissue paper. His face was 23 years old. He'd been dead for 14. The rain hammered the bus shelter's metal roof like distant mortar fire, a sound that meant nothing here, meant everything everywhere else. She'd walked out of Sacred Heart at 0527 without turning around. Sterling's investigator had spent the previous 16 hours reviewing every chart she'd touched, not to find errors, but to fabricate them. 3 board members had received calls by 2200. By midnight, the external review had escalated from routine quality assurance to formal investigation. Sterling had weaponized her own precision against her. A pattern emerged on paper that never existed in reality: discrepancies in medication counts during her shifts, timestamps that didn't match her documented locations, pharmacy audits flagged and flagged again until the narrative was predetermined. The man understood institutional power the way surgeons understood anatomy. He knew exactly where to cut. Her ex-husband had texted at 0134, "Is everything okay?" She hadn't responded. Marcus would wake up for school at 0645 thinking his mother was still employed, still respectable, still the kind of person who had a future that didn't involve moving back into a shared apartment with someone who'd never understood why she woke up screaming at 0300. The bus was 7 minutes late. The driver didn't make eye contact when she boarded. What they didn't know, what Sterling didn't know, what the investigator didn't know, was that every single chart Ashley had touched was backed by a Navy investigator who'd been auditing Sterling's billing records for 4 months. The investigation had started with a whistleblower complaint about phantom surgical consults at Methodist Hospital in Dallas. Then at Mercy General in San Antonio. Then at 3 others across East Texas. The pattern had led to Sacred Heart. To Sterling. The Navy investigator had been building the case quietly, watching Ashley's charts come in, recognizing the telltale marks of someone who'd learned to document under combat conditions where one mistake meant another medic's death. The precision was a signature. The Navy knew exactly who Ashley Cooper was before the SEAL commander had ever deteriorated at 2,200 hours. Sterling had no idea the trap was already set. He was attacking a ghost while the real threat was building a federal case. By 11:30 that morning, the Houston Police Department received a call about a commotion at Sacred Heart. A minor. School uniform. Carrying what looked like military decorations in a shadow box. The lobby staff didn't try to stop him because no one had thought to bar a child from entering. Marcus moved through those corridors with the single-minded focus of a 17-year-old who'd found something that belonged to his mother in her storage unit, had recognized what it meant, had understood that the world was lying to him about who she was. He burst through the main entrance at 1,203 hours, pushing a shadow box in front of him like a battering ram. The lobby froze. A woman in scrubs, name tag read Chen, resident, looked up from the front desk. Marcus opened his mouth. His voice cracked on the first word. Mom. Then, louder, Mom works here. She's a nurse. Her name is Ashley Cooper. These are hers. A trembling hand, Chen's, reached for the shadow box. The nurse's eyes moved across the decorations with the careful deliberation of someone reading scripture. 3 bronze stars. Navy Cross. Two purple hearts stacked at the bottom like bookends. A folded American flag. And beneath them all, a file folder in Marcus's shaking hand. Chen opened it. Her voice, when she read aloud, carried the weight of understanding something she'd been too junior to question before. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, Navy SEAL Medical Corps. Citation for Valor. Sanjin Valley Extraction. Marja Hospital Defense. Operation Grizzly Medevac under fire. She paused. The paper trembled. Femoral artery hemorrhage control, 40 minutes of sustained pressure while rounds impacted the structure. Chen's eyes lifted to the other staff gathering around her. She held him together for 40 minutes. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of recognition. The silence of a lie finally correcting itself. The elevator opened at the far end of the lobby. Commander Jake Morrison rolled through in a wheelchair, his Master Chief walking steady beside him, both men in dress uniforms that looked pressed by someone who still cared about details. Morrison's left shoulder bore the weight of someone who'd nearly died and was still learning to use his body again. His eyes found the decorations immediately. His Master Chief stepped forward, a man built like a load-bearing wall with a call sign inscribed in permanent marker on his jacket, Holloway. Master Chief Holloway's jaw tightened. He began pointing. One finger. One medal. One sentence. Sanjin Valley. 2010. Enemy fire. She went back for Rodriguez. Another medal. Marja. 2011. No air support. She held the perimeter. Another. Operation Grizzly. 2012. Medevac under fire. She didn't put the artery down for 40 minutes because the bird couldn't land. He stopped. His voice dropped into a register that belonged to men who'd watched their brothers die and lived to remember every second. That's not a decoration. That's a witness statement. That's the room saying she was the reason we came home. Morrison, from the wheelchair, saluted. His hand shook. Senior Chief Petty Officer. He was saluting rank he'd never known was in the building. That's when the Navy investigator emerged from the stairwell, a woman in a dark suit carrying a file folder thicker than a medical textbook. Her badge said NCIS. Her expression said this moment had been a long time coming. She moved to the center of the lobby and raised her voice without shouting, which is the only way someone truly makes themselves heard. Dr. James Sterling is being investigated for federal healthcare fraud. Phantom billing across 17 hospitals. Shell company kickbacks. Tax evasion. The amount in question is $1.3 million. A federal warrant was issued at 0900 this morning. She paused. The overhead lights buzzed. The rain outside sounded like applause. His medical license is suspended effective immediately. Full criminal charges pending. Sterling appeared from the administrative corridor. His face had gone the color of fluorescent ceiling tiles. He was holding his coat like it might protect him from something. He looked at the medals. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the Master Chief in dress uniform. He looked at the NCIS agent. His mouth moved but nothing emerged. His hands, which had signed phantom consults and redirected millions of dollars into accounts he thought were untraceable, began to shake. That was when the two-star admiral walked through the lobby doors. Not the question of whether one was coming. The certainty. He wore a Navy dress uniform that had been pressed by someone who understood consequences. He pointed at Sterling without speaking, a gesture that contained entire vocabularies. Security moved. Not fast. Not rough. Just inevitable, like gravity. The Admiral's voice, when he spoke, sounded like iron filing across concrete. Your medical license is revoked pending full investigation. You are to surrender all patient records within 48 hours. Your cooperation determines whether this includes criminal negligence charges related to patient abandonment. Sterling's mouth opened. Nothing. The Admiral gestured again. They escorted him toward the exit. News cameras were already rolling in the parking lot. The Houston Chronicle had received an anonymous tip at 11:45. Channel 11 News arrived at 11:57. By 12:05 hours, Dr. James Sterling was walking toward a police transport vehicle while local news cameras captured every frame. The lobby didn't erupt. That's what made it worse for Sterling. No cheering. No revenge. Just the sound of 1,000 people understanding that the lie had finally failed. Chen still held the folder. Marcus still stood in his school uniform. The Master Chief stood beside Commander Morrison's wheelchair like a guardian at a gate. The rain outside sounded like certainty. Ashley never saw any of it. She was on a bus heading downtown, holding her cardboard box, watching Houston slide past in the rain. Her phone would light up in 4 minutes. A text from an unknown number: check the hospital security feed. Channel 11 News. She would watch the footage in a coffee shop bathroom, her hand steady, her face unchanged, understanding that the quiet had finally broken. That Rodriguez's photo, still in her box, still close to her heart, meant something again. That she was no longer invisible. That sometimes the cost of truth was having to stop hiding from it. But that part comes later. First there's the moment when everything stops being secret. First there's the moment when a 17-year-old boy realizes he's finally figured out who his mother really is. First there's the moment when an admiral walks into a hospital lobby and the lies simply collapse under their own weight, like a structure that was never sound to begin with. 6 months later, the dedication plaque went into the marble lobby of Sacred Heart Hospital. Bronze letters on polished stone. The Ashley Cooper Center for Combat Medicine. In honor of Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, Navy Medical Corps. 3 bronze stars. Navy Cross. For valor. For commitment. For what we do when no one is watching. Ashley stood at a podium in dress whites that no longer felt like a costume, teaching 200 residents and physicians about needle decompression technique, about field pericardiocentesis, about the difference between protocol and keeping someone alive when the protocols fail. Her voice had changed. Not louder. Deeper. Authorized. The voice of someone who'd earned the right to give orders. Marcus sat front row. Master Chief Holloway stood at the back door with his arms crossed, nodding approval at every technical point. Commander Morrison, fully recovered, stood in dress uniform beside the podium, a living citation. A walking demonstration of what happened when someone refused to quit. Sterling was teaching CPR at a community college in Galveston for $18 an hour, his hand shaking while he demonstrated chest compressions on a rubber dummy to students who didn't know they were learning from a convicted felon. His medical license was gone. His wife had filed for divorce on day 2. His attorney had dropped him on day 3. The federal plea deal had required him to surrender $847,000 in assets. The community college had one security camera that occasionally captured him in the parking lot, watching the news coverage of the hospital dedication on someone's phone, understanding that there was a building he could never enter again, a building that was supposed to be his monument, now served as his gravestone. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And what you do when someone finally turns them on. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that the quiet warriors among us deserve recognition, that truth has a way of breaking through systems designed to hide it, like this video, subscribe for more stories about the ones the world didn't see coming. Share this with someone who needs to understand that their hidden strength matters. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value? Because those are the stories worth telling.